each other, a dog or something else, or even a steak. It's within us. It's just we keep it where it is today. And when the story goes is that when animals and people separated, it created conflict between the two. And part of the conflict was recorded in the landscape where those conflicts were. And that's the beginning of our written history. And part of that conflict is the story of Yellowknife emerges as two brothers raised by an old man, and they did some things and started creating these sacred sites all over our areas and all over the north. And part of the travel was to places where he traveled is logged by place names, what happened in that area, and some of the things that he did that we continue to follow today. And some would call it rituals. But they're very, very, very real, and part of going on the landscape was that when you're in the area, people have a tendency of talking about what happened in those sites. And after the conflict was over, then all the place names started to be added, which has more to do with where animals habitat, harvesting areas, netting places, proven areas. It's like, where McDonald's is, where the grocery store is. Same things that you really need, that you need to know, and how to get there. So these are the, and there's lots of place names. If you go to any Aboriginal group, you look at their maps, it's just full of place names. But they're really stories, they're pages in a big dialogue. And so you have this, before contact is the source of your Aboriginal rights and titles. And that's the source of conflicts today and the ongoing talks between settling claims and stuff like that. But something happened, beginning in 1492 and eventually moved all the way up here into the 1800s. And the big drawdown happened, and that drawdown had to do with ownership of land. Because that ownership of land has started the magic date in 1763, when the Crown took it upon themselves to have the authority over all the lands, and then they're the ones who grant lands now. And the second drawdown was through the trade, where all the that's the same one, going as far back to 1670, which is all the economics of fur trade, all the animals, caribou, moose, anything that could be traded was traded. And so that's the biggest drawdown, was the economics and self-sufficiency. And the third big drawdown was the treaties, and going back as long as 1763 and all the way till 1920s. And this part is the numbered treaties, and these are the unnumbered treaties. So the biggest drawdown at that time was health, education, social services, and non-renewable resources, mining. So those things were all drawn down, And when Canada eventually got recognized by British North America Act in 1867, they assumed their responsibilities by delegation by the Crown in 1867, so that it became its own decision makers, and then they started making treaties on behalf of the Crown. Until 1982, when Canada now can have its own ability to make agreements as it is. And part of the ways government works is that it has a structure of government and it has departments. And it also has entities. There's very many, everybody in Canada works for entities, except for the ones that are actually working for government, like NGOs, banks, anybody who's licensed. They register with Canada. That's how the people are tracked, including individuals with your income tax, you're tracked. And the money all goes back to Canada, and then it's redistributed through here. And eventually, in 1967, the NWT government established for the first time in the Northwest Territories. Prior to that, it was being run out of Ottawa. And through that presence, they also created entities. And so the story is, well, where did we fit in? We don't. Okay. Because Canada, what it did through its entities was through the agent, created the Indian Act, and this is where we are. That's where we are. And one of the things that it did in the early years was that, you know, like let's take the churches. They were authorized by the Crown as one of the entities that it licenses to dip into here, remove, and that's the legacy of the residential schools. And after the 1950s, when people were now had the ability to hire lawyers, because up till 1955, 56, the people here could not hire lawyers. They could not hire anybody, and they couldn't vote until 1961, and were kind of corralled. And the only way to get out of it is through permits. And if you don't come back, then that's how you lose your status. Okay. And over here, in the 1960s, when this, when people started to vote, they kind of became like the ability to vote, and now you become eligible for services. And the people responsible for delivery of services now have the ability through their departments, because if you've been under this regime since 1876, right now it's 150 years, then even in 1960s, you've been under this thing for over 100 years. And by the time, you know, the publicness of Canada started to go into that area, people were pretty ragged. You know, you had lots of breakdowns, you had residential stuff, and things were not quite normal, because one of the examples is that in the early years, even in the 60s, people didn't have fridges, they didn't have electricity, they weren't part of the grid. And so if Child and Family Services look at that, they would be appalled. And so that's how they started removing. And that's the beginning of the 60s school.
And it still continues today because the improvements haven't happened yet, and the standards are higher than what's there. And so that becomes part of that legacy that's there today. One of the things about that is that this is the only education that we know. That's the only education we know. And so when we look at the narrative, is that if you take land, for instance, generally people are here, but we're being serviced over there. And the only thing that goes into here is what they call land councils, and the decisions have to be made on the land council resolution, and it goes to the department, and then there's just a pipeline here. That's it. Okay, up until 1960s. But this hasn't developed itself so that if a community is established, a corporate community is established in where you live, then those corporate communities, because it would be under the GNWT, that it would not recognize land councils. And the only way that they'll listen to you is that if you have to set up a public system alongside the Indian Affairs system, but you're over here, those things don't belong to you. It's a way of making decisions that those governments can recognize, because it doesn't recognize anything over here. And so 1969, people are here, federal government, territorial government, that it looks like everybody has assimilated. And so the big paper was about, well, let's just all come and join us. You know, forget about the stuff. We'll be one big happy Canadian family. Forget about it and just join us. And that's when people rose and they established the big Indian Brotherhood across Canada, now called AFN. And then you had provincial territorial associations. And in the north it was called the Indian Brotherhood of the Northwest Territories. And eventually, when things got to, so if you look at the emblem of the original Nation, you can see some wings and legs and things like that over here with the Indian Brotherhood of Northwest Territories. But as things developed, you have to kind of take out some form of entity, a corporation, so that you can have a group of people come together, meetings, money exchange going back and forth. They have to be tracked. And so the emblem that they eventually settled on in the late 70s was the emblem of Yamuza with the 3 beavers and the arrows, and that's the next step. Okay. And then now the people are working towards some form of recognition, because we know that through all this phase that they kept the story alive, but they logged all the impacts into the area so that they know what happened. So the place names talk about that first impact, the second impact, and the third impact. And now we're working with the governments, and the only way the reason that it started was because they took the government to court on a caveat. But eventually, the courts decided with Canada, because the common law, it doesn't recognize Aboriginal rights and titles. It only recognizes common law. Okay. Common law for fee simple lands, and it doesn't recognize that. So the big thing was that, okay, well, the courts didn't agree with it, but they said there was something there. And the only way to get to it is to negotiate between the two parties, come to an agreement, and then it'll be passed through the laws to recognize what we come up with. And so this is where the big recognition comes in. The big recognition comes in, and then you have your governance. And I'm not going to get into the detail of that, but how do you finance? How do you finance all that stuff? Well, you go through negotiations. All we've done is, okay, well, the only form of recognition Canada has given us was this Indian Act bubble, where we're in there, and they were providing some limited funds. It's a form of recognition, so that's the beginning of moving what they had and making the arrow go the other way for once. Make the arrow go the other way for once. But with health, education, social services, we're looking at how to deal with the health delivery based on the information over here and not based on the information over here, because this is not ours. So we're going to tell our stories through the SPOR unit to influence policy development. And that's what the SPOR is about. But it means that we need to go into the communities and get them to talk about the life that they had, which was healthy living, and these people lived and survived, and over here it's just a constant struggle. So the story goes is that we not only make the arrow go the other way for once, but all the income taxes that are paid over here, we pay taxes over here, so we're going to take those with us when we go, because it's the people that live there in the communities that are going to benefit from that tax for the first time. And the goods and services, those also go with it. And if you see now that if you have crown corporations, which are government-controlled entities, you can do P3s, you can build roads, you can build buildings, and you can also do even hydro dams through those processes. But what about the other entities that are independent, like NGOs, even an entity like this, CIHR sponsored, and then we create this thing to create a space in between where the systems and the systems of the people up here, we can have this dialogue and see how we can work together to do an implementation, part of an implementation. And one of the other things is the education, because this is the only thing we really know. And you have to be part of the system to allow for it, but it doesn't recognize this. And so the idea is that the words that we use a lot nowadays is what happens in between the two places, this bridging between the two systems. One is over here would be knowledge translation, and then the other one would be scientific. And when we talk about universities, where we have an opportunity to do something very different than what we're used to. If it's going to be built solely around this system, the narrative that was developed in 1492 would still continue. So what we're talking about is changing that narrative to talk about, maybe ownership of buildings. Where should it be located? Well, if it's going to be located just exclusively in this area, then the old narrative continues. And so we need to reach the people of the north, because Yellowknife is, the city of Yellowknife is a corporate community. It has no history, but it takes everything. And probably most of Yellowknife is controlled by American and Canadian corporations down south. That's where all our money goes, all the big buildings. And all we're doing is servicing that industry in the south. And so we need to develop something in the north, which all northerners can benefit. And so that means that, we have something that was built up where you had campuses in the three areas, which is Yellowknife, Inuvik, and Fort Smith. Well, those are something that has helped build those communities, and we need to enhance them where they are and make them stand alone. And we shouldn't have a central headquarters, because those can be resourced for what they're going to deliver. And it creates a direct pipeline to the people living in that area, even in the corporate communities that are in that area, that even kids can see where they're heading to for the first time. And right now, we don't see where they're heading to. They're going to have to go somewhere 1,000 miles south to even get an education, but that education is only about how you can survive in that area without your identity. And for us, identity is very important. And this thing for us is just a skill. It's a skill development of how to interact in that area, so that we'll always be who we are, but we need the skills to operate in this area to give strength to continue our practices of language, culture, and way of life. And so this is what there's a little bit more detail, but with the amount of time that I have, I can only draw these lines to say that those things are inherent. They're inherent. It's really our inherent right of self-government. And we have our base constitution that has been developed over time, and our stories are embedded in a landscape. So what we're looking for is is a continuance of that, but to continue with that is that even though you have a land claim, this system still continues the way it is, because there's nothing to say that it's changed, because all you have is an agreement, but the policy of the systems down here is carry on as you are. And the only way to make changes without that policy in place, that's going to take a long time to develop, is to do it project by project. If we can do it with the university, that's implementation. But it's a beginning of some sense of policy development. And so that's how this thing happens. And at the time of treaty here in 1921, our leader who represented us, when he's tasked with his treaty that he's going to sign, and also will be signed by Canada, that the treaty was already written down on the keyboard. That's why when you look at the treaties, it says, adhere to Treaty 11, meaning that it's already written, all you have to do is agree. But there was a difference between the two, and so the way people were thinking and the way they were thinking was two different things, but people were not legally recognized. So how do you come up with an agreement that you, even before you had treaties, you were already in this box since 1876, and your treaty happened in 1920s, and some even earlier. But they're already under the Indian Act, so there were already wars. We were already wars with no decision making. And so a lot of the words, if you look at a lot of writings across Canada and even in the north, people would say, as long as the sun rises. As long as the sun rises, the river flows, because it's got to be developed, things change. And this thing doesn't take over, that we would not be restricted from our way of life, that that things are going to change in time, as was shown that it has changed very quickly. But with that change, it leaves a lot of things behind, where this thing is being destroyed through this thing. And what the land claims government is about is to get yourself out of here. You're negotiating your way out of it into an area where you were before, and you're going to take a whole bunch of tools with you. And one of them is education, social services, and health. But those things, even though you get recognized in your land claims, and the system hasn't changed. Policies have been developed. And so we're also doing some research with Aboriginal groups across Canada through SHRC on development towards an implementation policy that will help a lot of groups that have already settled the claims, but the system hasn't changed. So it's a way of telling our story so that we put together our narrative with the narrative of Canada and put in the rules of engagement so that this thing would be recognized. We'll protect it ourselves. We're not asking for a form of welfare. We're talking a form of just practicing who we are. And this thing is a skill set that we can use so that the benefits that were drawn down one way would somehow come back and make the arrow go the other way from here and plug into this system. And that's what policy development is making the arrow go the other way from us. Okay. Once we get that pipeline going, claims is the first thing. Is that once you do that first arrow going north, the other ones will follow. But it's going to take dialogue, and it's going to take initiatives that any governments do over here that's going to impact on here. Sure, you want to have a say on it because that's the way it's going to have to go. Almost time is up. Maybe I want to leave some time for any questions that people might have. But one thing I know is that what the elders were telling me is that, you know, this is what our leaders said in 1921, and the river is a place where we would work out in a fluid, the two views without hindering things over here, but allowing for a retinkering of this so that this thing eventually not exist sometime in the future. And it's going to be a long time yet. It might be hundreds of years yet before that thing disappears. But we need to get it rolling. So this thing is, I guess, what I call Gunao, which is just means our way of life. This means our way of life. And I remember the date, March 14th, because it's been advertised for such a long time. That, you know, a way of teaching is that this is who we are. We just need to learn the skills without having to give up who we are, because the old system is about being corralled and with the assimilation continuing and these things continuing, and to some degree the legacy will continue for a long time until we build up our systems so that we don't have to be bothered by that, and we'll stand on our own 2 feet. Mas Joe. If there's any questions or things like that, I can answer for a few minutes. My speech. It just says, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you everybody for coming, and all I can say is that this Polytechnic University is about changing the narrative. Okay? That this story has been told for such a long time that looking at this as an intrusion is not the way of looking at it. We're looking at it as a recognition of what has always been there. But the dialogue has to happen the same way the chief in 1921 and even the Red Cross Canada, when they're looking at this, they say that, you know, as long as the sun rises, because when we were in this area with all the drawdowns, we were being asked to just extinguish what you have and come and join us. That's what extinguishment is about. And what we're seeking more of well, we're looking more about certainty about where we're going and where you're going, and have a dialogue in between us. And so that most universities, like all the universities in Canada, are entities over here that do research. And most of the research in the old days was done to us, but not with us. Okay? And so that narrative also has to change. And here, under the federal government, we're going to add an entity, one of the mind-altering entities. And so we have to look at it as a skill set rather than something that would be used to further encroach. And encroachment is not something that we're looking for. We're looking for an involvement to find words, to put meaning to the words that the chief has spoken. As long as the sun rises, the dialogue happens, listening doesn't take over, that we would have the ability to have young people to be strong like two people over here, that they can operate in that area to develop something that would be very common. And so this is where the strong like two people fits in. The ability to work on both sides. Same way that the strong like two people is just not an Aboriginal thing. It also applies to here, that there has to be some meaningful dialogue and recognition by all the people that up in the north. Must enjoy again. Okay, Rachel, what do you like to do here?
Are there any questions? Has there been any dialogue with our MLAs between yourself and this idea, the importance of it?
I think we heard it just the same way we did with everybody else sometime last October. The first thing that Hotıì said that we're doing is we immediately went to the legislative committee to voice our reasoning that we need to ensure that the university represents everybody in the north, and it can't be done the old way. It's got to be done in a new way because we live in a time that's very fluid, where more people are operating in this area more and more. And what I'm saying is that project by project by project by project, or an alteration of the way things work, is the only way to make those changes presently. And the policy developments, the bigger one in Canada, is going to take years and years, way maybe even beyond our lifetime. And even in the north, there is no policy. So things still continue the way that they are now. Well, thank you for coming.
Do you see any examples out there in the world of that can sort of help guide us on what's possible, that we can see your experiences in educational institutions where this partnership and this new way of doing things has happened successfully?
Well, we don't know where it is right now. I think through these series of talks that GNWT has put together is, it's a first opening. It's a first opening for me anyways. I haven't seen it before. That it would have been nice if it happened with a new hospital, because I think that one is owned by corporations in the south. Who owns it in the north? So all our money is just big pipeline going going south. And all we're doing is, as taxpayers, is making our money and paying it back. And we have no ownership. And so this thing has to be done very differently. We need to change the narrative. We need to change our way of doing things. And to some degree, the planning probably has started. I don't know. But the only thing that we have going for us now is our ability to communicate, and I think GNWT making the space for that dialogue is a small step, leading towards a bigger thing that we should all be a part of.
I have a question. My name is Dawn, and what you're proposing is that we start with something small. You're saying project by project. But the Polytechnic idea, it's pretty big. So are we putting the cart before the horse? It's just a question.
I think the cart is already in front of the horse. We just want to change it and switch it the other way. Right?
Can you give an example how we might proceed differently?
Yeah. Well, one of the ways to proceed differently is the locations. The locations should be in the areas that the people are in. Like if you already have stations in Fort Smith and you live in here, then let's make them all have campuses, and they're resourced, and you have a governing body made up of people in the north, so that you have a real say. And part of the governance is that they operate in this area so that the balance is maintained between the two. That the old way of doing things that we've just abandoned by going this way is now we need to recognize this new way of thinking where we're not only getting people to strengthen themselves, but the resurgence of indigenous values are starting to surface. But it's only in how we look is starting to change. But the real nuts and bolts that hold things together, some have to be tightened up, and some things need to be loosened up, and some things need to be removed. It's the dialogue, I think, is where the word would really count. But that dialogue would only happen if there's enough force of population to demand that dialogue, and even talk about how it's going to happen and how it's going to roll out, so that when those plans are being developed, a lot of these thought processes are taken into consideration where it has never been taken into consideration before.
So I just have a question about how, going forward, how are we including the youth in these conversations and these ideas? Because I really see it as the youth being some of the first people to graduate from their high schools and their communities, and then go to this new thing. So where are they in these conversations?
Good question.
I know, right?
That's a very, very good question, because all we can rely on is that in this system where most of the youth are operating in, this is all they see. And but through the recognition of this, that they would see themselves from here as the people who are going to benefit the most, that they would have to start operating in this area. Because our generations and older generations, we're stuck in our ways. We're we're developing this space for them to expand on what the reality of how it's going to happen. And so the involvement of the youth has to happen somehow, but who has control over that dialogue? Currently, it's all in this area.
Sorry, just to add on, I'm going to say something that might be kind of contentious, but I do feel like the current education system that exists in the Northwest Territories is failing a very large number of students, in that they're graduating either in their communities and not actually graduating, they're walking or whatever it's called. So they experience a ceremony, but they're not set up in a place where they can then pursue their education without having to first move south to do upgrading or go to the college, rural college, and do upgrading. So I think like this is amazing that we're having this conversation, but I think we're taking people potentially from an organization that's, I'll say, broken or not serving the people as well as maybe it could be. Maybe it needs some of this, it needs some change. So how, like, I think we need to build that in too. Like, because if we have a number of students that either didn't complete that sort of schooling successfully and then are looking at doing this, how do we bridge that gap that because maybe they didn't, in their mind, didn't feel that they were successful in the traditional school system because they don't have a piece of paper or they didn't have, you know, a positive experience. How do we bridge that so that they can be successful in this new dream system?
Well, one thing I know about the current education is that you know, the teachers and the workforce over there, they're not the problem. The problem is systemic. Okay. And the systems is that to some degree we're still here, because if you look at the statistics, that the larger centers have higher levels of education or completion, while the rest of the north is at an all-time low. And the only way to benefit into this area is you somehow have to upgrade to qualify. Okay, so it's a layered thing. But universities have a big role, because these are southern universities, but they'll probably be plugged in through partnerships. But this is where the narrative would change through research, because most of the policy development is through research in partnership with universities and communities. They have the freedom to do those kind of things, but we need a forum that's made in the north, built in the north, and designed for the north, and then we can plug into the rest of it through partnerships. And so that's the way that we're looking at it. Is the opening currently is over here, and so how it rolls out is how it's designed. The influence about how it's designed is very heavily on this side. Okay. And so because universities are school of thoughts, that this thought process has to link both traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge, so that the narrative is altered, changed, and even accepted to some degree. That things are not going to change. Like, we'll still be living in the north. We'll still be, working. A lot of things can happen to develop things that were never developed in this area. Okay? Because the knowledge or the scientific knowledge has never reached up there. And so that's what it was. It's either you're not government workers, or all unemployed,